I came here in 2007. I was invited to accept a job here at the university, and I did. And I've loved it ever since. I really like it here, and I had never been to Nebraska at all before that, so this is the middle of my 17th year, and I'm really enjoying it. I like the university, I like my students. The people here are really friendly, kind, and calm. And I love the land, the sandhills. I love knowing about the Oglala aquifer. Um, and it's just beautiful. I really like it. Very peaceful. I grew up in Miami and England and West Virginia. And when I graduated from high school in West Virginia, I went to Texas to go to college, and I attended Trinity University in San Antonio. My major was English, and then I went to Texas A&M University for my master's degree and my PhD, also both in English. And I just always loved to read, and it seemed to be the only thing I was good at. I wasn't very good as a waitress, and I thought, well, this is something I enjoy, and I was very nervous to become a teacher. I have, like some social anxiety, public speaking anxiety, so it was hard. And I think it really grew me to get in front of room after room of people and share the thing that I really loved with them, which was reading and writing. I think it's been a tremendous stabilizing force in my life. As I said, really loved being here. And it's an interesting place. It's a subtle place. I haven't set any of my books here. I tend to write about places that are far away from where I am. It's a source of escape, right? So no matter where I am, I write about somewhere else. So like the two books that we were talking about earlier, set in New Orleans, I wrote those here, and a book set in West Virginia, and most recently a book set in Key West. But I think that Nebraska has been a really welcoming home and a source of wonderful friends, and I love being here. I love running in the little neighborhoods near where I live. I live downtown. When I first moved here, I moved to downtown Lincoln to be able to walk to work at the university on campus, and I've stayed in downtown Lincoln. So I love like running in the near south or on the trail by Salt Creek, or over in the North Bottoms. I really like the North Bottoms. I find the different little neighborhoods that I can get to on foot to be very fascinating and enchanting. I like the architecture, and I like the histories that are not always so immediately visible on the surface. I started writing at an extremely early age. I learned to read very young when I was 3, and immediately started making little books out of the memo pads that my father would bring home from his work. I would make little picture books, and as soon as I could write, I would be writing the words. Mostly it was like little animals. I think I was heavily influenced by Beatrix Potter. So I wrote little books about animals and their adventures, and I was always writing in my mind. So if we would drive somewhere or go on a longish car trip, I would, sit in the back and close my eyes and see movies that my imagination was making up. And then when we got somewhere, I would try to write them down. And so always from a very early age, to me, it seemed like the natural complement to reading, which I adored. Yeah, but becoming a writer, I don't know that I've ever really felt, I don't know if I've ever felt like I'm not a writer, and I don't know if I thought, oh, I am a writer one day. I think probably when my first story was published in a national journal when I was in graduate school, when I was a master's student, I was like, oh, okay, well, people like reading it too then, that's nice. And when my first book was published, those are all sort of milestones. But I really just like writing. I like the verb, not so much the noun, you know. The most significant person in my writing life is Catherine Mansfield. She was a New Zealand author. She was a modernist writer, and I was supposed to be diagramming sentences in my 11th grade English class. We were talking about public school and English teachers, and my 11th grade English teacher, she was actually the coach of the majorettes, and she didn't really care so much about English, and she would come in and she would clap like a majorette and everything, but she didn't really care what we did so far as I could tell, and I really hated diagramming sentences, so I would whip through it really fast. And then I opened the back of this dusty old anthology, and there was a story by Catherine Mansfield called A Cup of Tea, and very simple, but I started reading, and I couldn't stop. And when I got to the devastating last line, I was like, oh, literature can do this? Like, why are they making me read the Scarlet Letter? You know, like, literature can do this, like this precision, this imagery, the delicacy and the heart and the emotion. I was like, I want to do this, and like, I want to write short stories. I want to write things that, and so then lots of other writers have been very important. Sandra Cisneros and Jean Rhys, Marjorie Latimer, George Eliot. I really love George Eliot, and especially her huge novel Middlemarch, which tells the tale of a whole town. Yeah, so a lot of different writers. And, you know, I studied the modernists for my master's and doctorate, so I really loved like the poet Wallace Stevens and James Joyce, T.S. Eliot, not so much, but Faulkner, Ernest Hemingway, you know, Gertrude Stein, very much Virginia Woolf. So that whole, you know, literary movement of modernism that really broke with the past and investigated subjectivity, that was really, really important to me. D.H. Lawrence, okay, all right, enough. Passion for the material. One Brilliant Flame is about a moment in history that's been almost entirely forgotten or even erased. It was something I never knew about growing up, even though it's my own family's long history. So the book is set in Key West in 1886, which is when the Great Fire of Key West occurred. So this was a huge conflagration that burned the city to the ground. In 18 cigar factories, over 600 homes. It was completely devastating. And Key West at that moment was, I think, the most prosperous city in the whole state of Florida. And Miami didn't really even exist yet. It was a bustling cigar town, and it had actually an incredible political importance at the time, which was that it served as the rebel base for the anti-colonial Cuban insurgents who were fighting in Cuba to expel Spain. So Cuba was still ruled by Spain at that moment in 1886. And for 30 years, the island of Key West, 90 miles away, so pretty easy journey by ship, served as this off-site rebel base where the cigar workers and all the other Cubans in Key West, and it was like over 50% Cuban at that time, they would raise funds and gather munitions to send soldiers and so on to fight in the war in Cuba. And I didn't know this. My own great-great-grandmother, widowed, came with her children to Key West in 1869, and her oldest son wrote an eyewitness account of those years. And it was fascinating. Like, there were assassinations, there were duels in the street, and as a young boy, like I think he was 9 when they landed, he just grew up in this rebel political community and took notes, you know? And in his old age, he wrote a memoir about it. And when my father died in 2002, under very sad circumstances, I found this eyewitness account among his effects. And also I found my grandfather's book of poetry among his effects as well, both in Spanish. And at that time I was devastated It was a suicide, and we were all in shock and very devastated, and so I didn't do too much with them, and I didn't know the larger political context at all. I think if you ask 20 people on the street, they'll have heard of the Spanish-American War, but not any of this history of Key West. And even the title, Spanish-American War, which is how it's been remembered in history, erases the Cuban presence, right from out of the name. So in 2019, I went to a National Endowment for the Humanities month-long research institute in Tampa that was specifically focused on the Florida tobacco towns, the cigar towns at that period, Key West and Tampa. And so I learned so much about it. Now it's like, when I learned that there had been this fire, all of a sudden my crime writers' ears pricked up because they suspected arson at the time. They thought it was either the Spaniards coming to try to wipe out the rebel base, or they thought that it was anti-labor, an anti-labor attempt to wipe out the workers who were like always striking for better labor conditions in the factories. They were very bold. So either way, they thought it was arson, but they could never prove it. So when I wrote, I thought, how can I bring a large audience, as large as possible, to this unknown chapter of history, or largely unknown? And so I thought, I will make it a crime novel. And that's what inspired me to write it. I wanted to bring it back to life because, like, none of my cousins, my brother and I, we didn't know about this history at all, but it's our history, right? Like, in no college class, never was this history of Key West included. And my family lived there for 100 years. And we had no access to understanding the political and economic past that we came from. I drew heavily on the work of historians. So there are scholars of the period who had written about that, and particularly Gerald Poyo was valuable to me when I was learning about that era and planning to write the book. He did a beautiful study of the Cuban enclave in Key West, and so that was tremendously helpful and powerful. And then Ada Ferrer, who recently won the Pulitzer Prize for her incredible book, Cuba, An American History, had written books before that, 2 books, and one of those books was invaluable to me as I was doing research. So in the back of One Brilliant Flame, I think I thank like 17 different historians, or at least historians of 17 books. I remember counting at one point, there were 17. And because it's just a very deeply researched novel, I wanted to make sure to get the details right and to make it as vivid and believable as possible, so that it would stand as a reasonable way into this historical period. And then also, if people get interested in the period, it lets them know where they can learn more. It had a tremendous impact on me personally. It was deeply moving. Of course, it was revelatory, it was illuminating, but it was really like, it was excavating a lost past. And so it was very deeply meaningful. Like, I really didn't know any of it. So it was exciting, and now being able to share it with my brother, with his son, with my son, it gives us a sense of continuity with our ancestors and what they experienced and what they did. I mean, they really made a little mark on history, Caribbean history, Latinx history, United States history. So it was very meaningful in that way. And when I launched this book, the launch happened in Key West, in the San Carlos Institute, which is on the first page of the book, right? It's right at the beginning of the novel. Zenaida and her mother are going to the San Carlos Institute, which was the hub of Cuban social and political life in Key West. And to actually get on the stage where the characters are in the book, like they have the bolita balls and they're tossing those, and like to be on that stage and to read to a largely, well, at least partially Cuban American audience in Key West with the flag of Cuba, like this was so trippy and surreal. And then every morning while we were down there, I would go running and I would run to what had been my grandparents' house on Elizabeth Street in Key West, 311 Elizabeth Street, and I would go and I would slap the wall that I had painted with my father when I was a little girl, and like to have that sense of connection and to like bring their story into public visibility, super deeply meaningful. And when I was at that Tampa Research Institute, I met a scholar of Galician Cuban literature from that period, and their name is Rai Johnson, and they are a professor at IU now, Indiana University in Bloomington. And they looked at that volume of poetry by my grandfather. It's called Lágrimas y Flores, Tears and Flowers. So it's about migration, but also romantic love for unattainable women, and also romantic love for nation, in his case, for Cuba. He was passionately committed to the Cuban cause of freedom from colonial Spain. Anyway, I forget where that sentence began, but Rai said, hey, these poems are actually really valuable from a literary standpoint. So for the last few years, we've been working on a translation. They are doing the translating, and then together we wrote the critical introduction that explains the historical context, and it's going to come out, I think, in 2024 from the University Press of Florida. But the cool thing about this is that for her 80th birthday, I was able to send the printed out manuscript to my aunt. So my grandfather's daughter, his oldest living child, and she has been reading it and is so moved. Like most of this she doesn't know, you know, and she didn't really have a sense of her father as anything else but papi, you know, her dad. And now, like, this world of politics and romance and passion that's from our family is opened up to her. So this is very deeply meaningful to me to be able to give this to my family as well as to the world. I should start by saying that I really love to write, that it's a pleasure, it's a joy. When I start to write, I do slip into that state that people call flow, and I do lose track of time. It's sometimes painful to have to wrench myself out of the notebook and go, you know, do my job or do anything else. I really do adore it. And so in terms of how I work best, I work best with unfettered time. And that can be at any time of day or night. When my son was little, I would write at night after he was asleep. When I was writing the 2 New Orleans books, I would wake up every morning knowing from, I wrote a little outline for myself to have a sense of where I was going, because those are, they're crime novels, so you kind of have to know the end and know how to get there. So I would read the little outline, like what has to happen in the next chapter before I would go to sleep. It was on my nightstand. And then in the morning, I would wake up, and before I did anything else, definitely not checking email or my phone or anything, I would write the chapter, just like straight out of the dream state into the chapter. Often I would dream about what needed to happen, so I would get whole scenes and then just write them down like taking dictation. This was a tremendous pleasure. I loved this. And I did this during the summer. I really do think that the great gift of being a teacher or a university professor is that you have summers not entirely off because you're expected to produce, but you don't have to be like getting dressed up and going in and talking to people. So I would write the chapter and then get up and start my day. And when I had the whole book written longhand, then I would start typing it in. And that seems to be a really efficient process for me because like most of us, I am inherently a little bit lazy. So if what's written in the notebook is not so great, I don't type it up, because why bother to do that work? So I end up editing right at that moment. And so it's really my second draft. By the time it becomes a document in a computer, it's my second draft, and then I print it all out and then edit on the hard copy. I can see it better than scrolling up and down on the computer. It makes it more real, and then I become more critical. And I try to give myself a lot of time before I look back at a draft, so that I can get like this sort of cool, neutral distance from it, and I can be more ruthless, cutting away the things that really don't work that well. I think the answer really honestly is no. I don't write to a particular audience as such. I think I'm trying to write to an ideal reader, someone who will understand all my illusions, someone who can take leaps with me when I make associative leaps, someone who loves language, someone who is a little smarter than I am and a little better morally than I am, with a finer vision. I try to write up to a reader. Yeah, an audience, not a particular audience, just to people who love to read and who hunger for a good story that's delivering more than only entertainment. So entertainment, yes, I'm very pro-entertainment, pro-pleasure, pro-delicious mystery and satisfaction, but also someone who's searching for more than that, some kind of ethical vision or a political illumination of some kind, or at least a kind of probing into questions that are deep and difficult, difficult, haunting questions. I want to be present for that kind of reader, I think, yeah. Definitely. And I would disarticulate those two things. If there's an individual who wants to write, then my encouragement would be to write as often as you possibly can, to let your work cool off and then reread it later when you can be cool and neutral and distant as much as possible, and then like make changes and revisions and keep making it better, making it stronger. And actually, this would also help the individual who wants to be published, right? And then, of course, reading into your own passion, for the voice on the page. Like, if you, like the way that I was talking about discovering Catherine Mansfield's voice on the page. So, okay, read everything by Catherine Mansfield then, and then who did she read, and who were her, peers that were influencing her. Read them, right? And sort of follow your own ear. Follow your own ear and your own hunger into those works that have been written that you can learn from, and just absorb them, just eat them up, and let them become part of you. And then in terms of getting published, there's all kinds of advice online about how to get published in various venues. So I think just doing your research in that regard would be the thing to do. And then, of course, there are now courses that you can take in college and high school that help you strengthen your work, and in college and graduate school, and there are summer workshops. Seems like they're everywhere. So you could search for like creative writing workshop, and sometimes at those workshops you can meet agents, editors, and really experienced teachers who can give you advice about how you might make your work even more publishable, and then where to send it, how to write a cover letter to send it with, how to use Submittable, which is an online portal for submitting literary work to all kinds of journals and magazines and presses too. So Yeah, there's a lot of information out there. So I would just encourage people to read what they love, to do their research, and then write, and don't be intimidated. Just plunge in. Keep learning and growing. I think with each of my books, I get better. So far, fingers crossed, but more ambitious. I tackle harder things. I never thought I was going to write a book of historical fiction ever. That was my very first One Brilliant Flame. And to say, oh, I'm going to tackle this period of history that I don't really know about, and then nobody knows about except a few scholars, and then I'm going to bring it to life. And that's very ambitious, and it's a polyphonic novel, so multiple voices, first-person narrators, 6 of them, 3 young men and 3 young women, all involved in that. That's Faulknerian, or Louise Erdrich has beautiful books that are told from different perspectives, first person. Not an uncommon thing to do, but for me, new and a challenge rather than a whole book in first person with one narrator and protagonist. So finding new challenges, technical challenges, challenges of content. Mostly I just want to keep writing. I love it, and I want to just keep doing it and see what happens. Yeah. Thank you. Yes, I do have something new in the works. It's a collection of short stories. It would be my second collection of short stories, and as I mentioned, short stories are my favorite form, really. I think they're the most beautiful, perfect gem-like form. And I'm working on that. Some of them have been published, and I think they're going to all be about women at pivotal moments in their lives who choose to do the very unexpected and maybe even transgressive, and then figuring all that out in a story form is what I'm doing with that collection. And then I have another novel that I'm thinking about, but that's next. Yeah.
Welcome to the John H. Ames reading series here in the Jane Pope Geske Heritage Room of Nebraska Authors at Bennett Martin Public Library. I'm Amber Stevenson, curator of our collection here. For those not familiar with the Heritage Room, our mission is to preserve and celebrate works by and about Nebraska authors. It's supported by the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association and the Foundation for Lincoln City Libraries. We're grateful for their help, which makes events like this possible. The Ames Reading Series gives Nebraska authors the opportunity to share their works with our community, and this is the 228th program since its beginning in 1985. And today we are delighted to host Dr. Joy Castro. Joy is the award-winning author of One Brilliant Flame, a historical novel of 19th century Key West, Flight Risk, a finalist for the 2022 International Thriller Award, the post-Katrina New Orleans literary thrillers Hell or High Water, which received the Nebraska Book Award, and Nearer Home, which has been published in France by Guimard's historic Série Noire, the story collection How Winter Began, the memoir The Truth Book, and the essay collection Island of Bones, which received the International Latino Book Award. She is also editor of the craft anthology Family Trouble, Memoirists on the Hazards and Rewards of Revealing Family, and the founding series editor of Machete, a series in innovative literary nonfiction at the Ohio State University Press. Her work has appeared in venues, including Plowshares, the Brooklyn Rail, Senses of Cinema, Salon, Gulf Coast, Brevity, Afro-Hispanic Review, the Seneca Review, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and the New York Times Magazine. A former writer-in-residence at Vanderbilt University, she is currently the Willa Cather Professor of English and Ethnic Studies, Latinx Studies, at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where she directs the Institute for Ethnic Studies. Please welcome author Joy Castro.
It's a pleasure to read to you today from One Brilliant Flame, which is the novel set in 1886 in Key West, Florida, and it draws on a little-known historical incident, the Great Fire of Key West, which razed the city to the ground. It was a terrible catastrophe, reported in the New York Times the very next day, and it was devastating for that small community, which relied greatly on the cigar industry, the hand-rolling of tobacco imported from Cuba. And so this novel looks at the situation from the perspective of 6 different characters. Hello, come in and welcome. Of 6 different characters who were in Key West at that time. Arson was suspected when this great fire happened, and all 6 of these characters had motivation to want Key West to burn. So it's kind of a whodunit, and there are 3 young men and 3 young women, and I'll read short passages in the voices of the 3 young women. And the first one is Zenaida. Her name is Zenaida, and she is an Afro-Cuban daughter of a woman who escaped enslavement in Cuba and is running the town's best boarding house in Key West. And I should say that galera just means gallery, so it's the big space in a cigar factory where up to 500 workers would sit and roll cigars all day. I think galera, and then elector. This was a person who would be on a high platform reading the news, political current events news, also political theory, and then also novels to entertain and educate the cigar rollers while they worked. And Zenaida, if it matters, is a 15-year-old girl. Outside the tall windows of the galera, I stood with my mother and other women who were free from work in the afternoon and who arrived at the factory to gather in clusters, our parasols jostling, and listen to the latest installment of the Russian novel the new lector had brought. Ostensibly, I too was there to listen, to better myself, as my mother said, to get an education. But, as always, I stood where I could watch Chaveta. Nimble, swift, and slim, her fingers flickered as she twisted the tobacco into a tube, wrapped it, and slicked it down with resin. Her hands on the knife trimmed the ends with a certainty I envied, the way my mother chopped an onion or the head from a hen, utterly free of hesitation, sure of purpose, as if doubt were unknown to her, as if she never wondered what to do. The new lector's voice described the vacillations of Anna Karenina, who seemed far more comprehensible to me, driven by desires, acting, then drawing back, anguished, judging herself, trying a different path, stumbling. She felt more real than the people I knew in my own life, who never seemed to question what they did, all so committed, so passionate, so sure, whether wresting Cuba from Spain's grasp, or marching in a strike, or making fistfuls of American dollars. They all seemed to know what and whom they wanted, while I watched and longed and wondered, unsure of what was right, unsure of what to do. And so I did nothing. I obeyed my mother, observed, listened, played it safe. Though Maceo had arrived on the steamer from Havana, he had not yet come to our boarding house, which was strange. Chaveta said he was staying a few nights with the Bozas first, and was said to be unwounded. He had come to rally troops, Chaveta said, to raise funds, to inform us of the progress in the field, and to wait for secret instructions from the Cubans in New York. He didn't yet know how those instructions would arrive, and he was seeking a way to smuggle them back to the guerrilla fighters, a way that could not be detected if the Spaniards captured him. Bent over her workbench, Chaveta blew a dark strand of hair from her face. Her cheeks were flushed with the heat of the galera. Outside, a breeze cooled us, and the shade of my pale yellow parasol shielded me from the sun, but still it was hot, and the full feeling from the good food at lunch made me drowsy. The handsome new lector read on, but my mind drifted from the story of Oblonsky and Levin and Anna and their lusts and woes, as Chaveta's hands twirled and spun the brown leaves into objects men would kiss to life and suck and burn, her head bowed over her work, a quick smile flashing on her face from time to time when some line from the lecture pleased her. Girl. A deep voice above and behind my shoulder. I turned. His eyes were dark and steady, and he wore a soldier's garb, mended, clean, a rebel fighter's clothes, the color of forests. He smelled of leather, soap, and horses. Hot flutters beat my belly. Maceo. Drink coffee with me. His voice stayed low, but still the other women glanced, cutting their eyes at each other. My mother's face was very still, but for a tiny twitching at the corner of her mouth. No, I said. I'm listening to this. You're listening to fiction, he said. His dismissive smile was faint. I'll tell you something real. My mother looked at me, her eyebrows arching so high they nearly hit her blue head wrap. Leave me alone, I said. I'm busy. I'll call on you this evening. I shrugged. Do what you like. His breath stroked the nape of my neck, and my hairs quivered, electric. Always, he said. Without turning to stare, I knew everything about Maceo by heart. His skin smooth and fine and easy to covet like polished teak, touchable, sleek, it sloped up over his cheekbones, which my fingertips hungered to trace. His brown-pink mouth was candy, ripe fruit, obscene and sweet, as if his lips were plump with juice. In comparison, I felt my own ugliness, all my features just slightly shy of perfect harmony, just close enough to beauty to fool others, but madden me when I prodded them with my fingers in the looking-glass. I had studied him for hours while he slept in the sickbed at my mother's boarding house, fevered from his bullet wound. I stood stock still, letting the moments pass, staring hard at the lector on his high platform to keep from swaying. As if he could feel my gaze, the lector read a sentence directly to me, his eyes on mine, but the sense of it did not penetrate my mind. Chaveta pounded her knife on the table in approval. Others followed her lead, and a thunder of metal on wood filled the air, deeper and stronger than the applause of clapped hands. When it faded, I felt the cool emptiness behind me, where Maceo's body had been, and the air no longer bore his scent. I glanced back to confirm the truth. He was gone. My mother's elbow nudged my ribs. Mama, stop, I said. It's nothing. She laughed. So that is from the perspective of Zenaida. And her friend Chaveta, who is a cigar roller in the factory, is the person who will speak next in this chapter. And Chaveta is a bit of a rebel herself. She hunts. So there at that time there were key deer in Key West. So she hunts deer on the weekends to help provide food for her family. She rolls cigars. She wears men's trousers. She smokes cigars. So she's a little bit unusual in the town at that time. And I should say that the book, I love this. The publisher allowed me to put little symbols for each of the characters. So Chaveta's little symbol is a cigar with a little stream of smoke coming from it to help readers navigate, since there are six different speakers, narrators. Okay. A wooden rectangle with 5 rectangles inside. That was our house in El Barrio de Gato, out on the far corner of Virginia and Duval, exactly like 1,000 other workers' houses here. If it were a cigar box and I opened the lid, You'd see the little parlor at the front with the wood stove we almost never needed to use. My mother was proud of the bright-flowered cotton curtains she'd sewn from sacks. They hung at all 3 windows. Then you'd see the bedroom for the 6 of us kids, our straw-stuffed pallets side by side on the floor, the walls papered with pages we picked from old newspapers, neatly glued, some yellowing, the recent ones still white, and you'd smell the warm, comfortable animal smell of us all nestled in our blankets. In the evenings, sometimes I used those newspapers to teach the little ones to read, sounding out the words by lamplight. Then my parents' bedroom, the only room with a door, so they could keep making more of us, Papi said. And then the kitchen with its cook stove, where a folding screen in the corner let us bathe with privacy, though no peace. One naked child after another ran through the house, wet and shrieking, as my mother grumbled after them with the towel. The long, thin rectangle of the hallway ran along the south wall and ended at the back door, which led outside, where 5 wooden steps took us down to the water pump and the privy we shared with our neighbors. Papi had added a front porch, a luxury, where we sat at night for the cool breezes. All the cigar workers had these little wooden box houses slapped up fast as business boomed, side by side, like tinder. Back when he drank less and was fun, my father used to call me my little hatwe. I'd climb up barefoot on the table and swing his chaveta like a sword. "Death to Spaniards!" I'd yell, leaping down. "Death to the lying dogs!" My mother didn't care for my games or for the nickname my father had given me, the name of a warrior chief who fought the conquistadors and was burned at a stake. So that name died. Chaveta stuck. My father said I had Taino in me from his blood, and Arawak from my mother's, that while the Spaniards claimed they had expunged all Indio blood from the island, that was a Spanish lie. Arawaks were fiercer, my father said, which is why it was so hard for him, a peace-loving man, to wrangle my mother like a wild horse that wouldn't be broken. I laughed. "What do you know of horses?" "Exactly nothing," he rolled his eyes, "which is why it took me so long to tame your mother." No one would tame me. No one. So that is the second of the 3 girls who form the key triangle in the book. Friends, good friends, but maybe with a tinge of frenemy there too, as we would say today. And the third friend, Sophia, is from a very different class and racial background. So her symbol is a fan, and her parents actually still own plantations back on the island of Cuba. A lot of people don't know this, but in 1886, enslavement was still legal in Cuba, and so that's one of the political issues that's fomenting here, as well as the anti-colonial struggle against Spain for the Cubans who wanted a free and independent nation. So Sophia's father also owns the cigar factory in which Chaveta works. This was a very interesting dynamic among the 3 girls and among the 3 young men who also get chapters of their own, but I won't read those today. But Maceo has his chapters, which I really love, and then Feliciano, the lector, who's named after my own grandfather, who was a lector in Key West. He has his chapters, and then Libano, who is a cafetero. A cafetero was the coffee server, like a barista, I guess, a little bit, but a mobile barista, because he would wear like a coffee urn around his neck and shoulders and go up and down the aisles of the galera in the cigar factories, quietly giving each person their coffee order, and a good cafetero would know all 100 or 500 coffee orders by heart. So it was kind of the caffeine fuel or the caffeine break that fueled the workers while they were rolling cigars and listening to the lector. So, yeah. And Sophia whom I'll read to you in a moment. She's a very unreliable narrator, let's say. One of the things I was interested in doing as a challenge for myself in writing this book was to create a genuine female sadist in literature. I had not come across a sadist in literature. Definitely female masochists and also female dominatrices who would act in a sadistic way to fulfill the desires of masochistic men. I had run across this, but we see all these male psychopaths, sociopaths, sadists all the time, on TV and crime shows and stuff, really. But I thought, it would be a very interesting challenge to try to write from the first-person perspective of a young woman who is genuinely a sadist, that is, somebody who derives a kind of pleasure, even erotic pleasure, from causing or witnessing pain to others. This was really a big challenge, but I'm hoping that I pulled it off, and I'll read you a little chapter of that. I'm just explaining all that so you don't think, this is depicted as a good person. Okay, all right. So, Sophia. At dusk, I sat sewing on the veranda. The sprawl of purple bougainvillea screened me from the street, and a small kerosene lamp lit my work. It was a decidedly romantic setting. My mother was off visiting her pious Catholic friends, my father was dining at the Hotel Russell with business associates, and my grandmother was upstairs in bed, no doubt already half intoxicated on her sherry and reading old Cuban romances. Even the maids had the evening off. Señorita, a young man mounted the steps. It was the cafetero, the one people called a fool. I have a message for your father, he said, from my boss at the coffee roastery. No one else was about. I studied him in the lamplight. His eyes were dark and beautiful, his black hair thick. The muscles of his arms bulged nicely, threaded with thick veins. Come, I said. Sit here. I patted the cushions next to me on the settee. He hesitated, twisting his cap in his hands. Oh, I couldn't miss. No, really, do, I said. You must. He sat. I could hear his breath. I embroidered, pulling turquoise floss through the damask again and again in precise and tiny stitches. There was no sound but his breathing and the sliding of the thread. He stared at the fabric, hooped taut, and at my hands, which did have a peculiarly beautiful waxen glow in the lamplight, very pale and very smooth. We both sat there watching my hands' serene and delicate movements, and I wondered if he could even think such words as spellbinding or mesmerizing or exquisite, if he even possessed such a vocabulary. He probably couldn't compliment me properly if he tried. He'd likely manage only beautiful or pretty. How dull it would be, such a courtship, which was why I supposed peasants simply didn't court ladies. Only knights, and even precious few of them, could make up sonnets on the spot. The cafetero said nothing. Paucity of vocabulary aside, he should have at least tried, but he simply sat there. This irritated me. I saw, though, that his hand had dropped between our two laps and lay very near my thigh. But it didn't move closer. It didn't dare. He said nothing. I glanced up at his face. He was no longer staring at my exquisite hands with their serene and waxen glow, but at my throat and décolletage, which was, if I remembered correctly, quite prettily arranged and edged with golden lace, though I had been expecting no particular company. His dark eyes rose to mine, and they were sweet and hungry. I looked down at that hand, brown and rough, against our green silk settee, and my needle moved through the air quite slowly and deliberately. Its sharp steel tip came to rest lightly upon his flesh, and then pressed. It pushed in just a little. The cafetero gasped. A red pearl of blood welled. I met his eyes, which were confused and pained and utterly humble, and a strange, delicious heat tugged low in my belly. The air smelled different, an unexpected kind of hot, burnt scent, like winter lightning. My legs shifted inside my skirt. I pulled away the needle. My eyes locked on his, and I lifted his great paw and leaned over it. My tongue lapped away the blood. He gasped again. Another, smaller pearl squeezed slowly out and sat there, red on his skin. I licked it off. He stared at me with his full lips parted, his eyes still hurt and wondering, as obedient as a hound's. I set his hand on the place in his lap that had been stirring, and he groaned. With men, the best way was to exit quickly and mysteriously, leaving them wanting and confused. So I did. Yeah. So that's a little sampling of One Brilliant Flame. And I loved writing this novel, and I really love getting to share it with you today. And I hope that it brings back to a public audience this really fascinating moment in U.S. history, Caribbean history, Key West history, in a way that's fun, a page-turner, and interesting and exciting. So thank you very much. I will be happy to answer questions.
So I missed your introduction as to who you are. I mean, are you from Cuba?
Thank you so much. So, and thank you for coming. So my family got to Key West in 1869. They came from Cuba in the midst of the 10 Years' War, which was the first of three wars, revolutionary wars of Cuba against Spain, which was still colonizing the country of Cuba. And this period of rebellion and fighting lasted for 30 years in Cuba, trying to expel colonial Spain. And Key West was an offshore rebel base for the insurgency. And that's where my great-great-grandmother moved when she was widowed. She took her young children to Key West. And my great-grandfather wrote an eyewitness account of that whole period. And we found that eyewitness account. He called it Mis Recuerdos, my memories, my memoirs. And also a book of poetry by my grandfather. They were printers in Key West. They did pretty much all the Spanish language printing for the island. When I was a little child, the printing press was still running in Key West, and my father worked in the press. My uncle worked in the press, and my father was the first person to leave. So he left in the 1950s to go all the way to Miami. Which is where I was born, in the 60s. So about 100 years after they had first come to Key West from Cuba, yeah.
So these relatives are on your father's side?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
So you are a part Arawak? That's a Native American.
Some of this is fiction.
Oh. Okay.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, it's a fiction. It's a novel.
Okay.
It's a historical novel because I got so fascinated with the period and the fact that I had never learned this in any history course ever growing up. Never, nothing. I didn't know any of it. And I mentioned in the earlier interview that we found those papers, those two little slim books among my father's effects when he passed away from suicide back in 2002. And I really didn't have a context for any of it. I didn't understand what they meant, what they were, what they signified. And I didn't learn about it until 2019 when I really plunged into research thanks to a really fantastic National Endowment for the Humanities Research Institute at the University of Tampa, where I went for a month. And this was the whole focus, was tobacco towns in Florida at the end of the 19th century. And Jose Marti, the Cuban rebel poet, essayist, freedom fighter, he's like a person of that period whose work is still taught today. But a lot of people don't know anything about the Great Fire of Key West, which really did happen in 1886. So I was really interested in trying to look at a cross-section of the main different cultural groups, social groups, economic groups that were populating Key West in that moment, and thinking about how each of them would have differently viewed the events that built up to the Great Fire. So the story starts on Valentine's Day, 1886, and the Great Fire happens at the end of March. So it's those weeks building up to the fire, which I think I mentioned this, that people did suspect arson. Arson was investigated really thoroughly at the time, but they couldn't find proof. It was a very suspicious circumstance, and they thought maybe it was like a Spaniard arsonist who had set the city aflame so that the rebel base would be destroyed. And they also thought that maybe it was one of the cigar factory owners trying to break the back of the labor movement there, which was very strong. There were strikes all the time because the labor pool, like on a little island, was very needed. So if people went on strike, they had a lot of power. And so Tampa, on the mainland of Florida, the white law enforcement structure in Tampa had already promised the cigar factory owners that if they moved their operations to Tampa, that they would break the strikes by any means necessary, right? But the law enforcement in Key West just didn't have that kind of power over the Cubans because the Cubans were about 50% of the population in Key West. Yeah, and some of the cigar factories were actually owned by Cubans, as is the case for Sofia. Like rich, white, Spanish, European Cubans did own some of those cigar factories at that time. So it's really interesting what we know from the historians who have written about that era and done the archival research is that people were strongly joined together across social, economic, and even racial lines for the cause of Cuban freedom from Spain. And the San Carlos Institute, which on the first page of the novel is where Zenaida and her mother go, and still stands today, a new building, they built it again after the fire. This was a gathering place for Cubans from all different walks of life, men and women. They had the first or one of the very first completely bilingual schools, so the students learned in Spanish and English, and completely racially integrated schools in the United States back in the late 1800s. And so it was a very fascinating moment and almost a kind of utopian moment in Key West at that time. And today, people really don't know about it. So, and the politics in Florida are not that today. And so I was really interested in recovering this moment of real hope and solidarity, but with tensions, also real tensions at the same time. No utopia is without them. So I wanted to bring that world back to life and to make it a pleasure, to make it a bit of a thriller and a little sexy and so on, So people to like, people to hate, yeah. So thank you. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, interesting. That's very interesting.
Thank you. It was a really interesting project, a lot of research, yeah.
So pardon my ignorance, but your research by reading, because you have you visited, and I say this because I've done some theater.
Oh, cool.
And I've had to research the character that I have to play, but research and really studying the character. So your research to write your novel, was it just reading that material, that the like original documents that you found, or have you actually gone to are they still making cigars?
Yeah. So,
because it's so well written in regards to the character, detail oriented.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. It's always really important to me to try, for any of the books that I've written, to try to go to the place, to be in the space. So I've spent a lot of time in Key West growing up as a child, visiting my grandparents, staying in their house there, as often as we could go back. And then as an adult, it was my very great privilege and honor to go to Cuba and to go to a tobacco farm, to see someone roll a cigar and learn that, to drink some of the little guava liquor and smoke a cigar on a Cuban tobacco farm was a really interesting experience, and talk to the guy whose family was running this small tobacco farm outside of Havana, west of Havana. And so that was an amazing like sensory experience. And then I've been into the Gato cigar factory in Key West, which is no longer an operational cigar factory, but it was the place where my grandfather worked, which was like kind of deep and special to go there. And there are like all kinds of like photographs, informational photographs on the walls and explaining what things were like. And also, if you're interested in this, in Tampa, I'm always blanking on the name of the little factory town where all the houses, somebody's gonna immediately know it, but in Tampa, it's still there. It's an area of Tampa where the cigar workers moved, and all the houses were like little small houses, like the one Chaveta describes with the 5 rectangles inside a rectangle, and you can walk through it and see it, how people did live at the time, and walk down the back steps, and there was the privy, and this is very, very interesting and illuminating to me to be able to do that. I think if I keep talking long enough, I'm going to think of the name of the place, but maybe it won't come back to me. But it's very famous, so it'd be easy to find out about. So some parts of it were being in the place, some parts of the sensory images, so they weren't outside too much in those chapters, but there are passages like when Chaveta goes out to the salt ponds, which still exist. You can go there in the mangroves and on Key West, and when she hunts and so forth, like the outdoor sensual, the fish at the fish market and the fruits and so on, those memories are from childhood and growing up and fishing off the docks in Key West with my father and so on. So some of it is lived, some of it is books, some of it is primary documents, archival materials, and then some of it is going and being in the places as much as I could, and like studying what was the structure of a cigar factory, what was stored on the bottom floor, the first floor, the upstairs, who worked up there, who was really hot, right? And this was actually mostly women and children who were called strippers, funny, and they would wrap the the tobacco leaf around their hand and twist it, and this stripped the veins of the leaf right out of the matter of the leaf without damaging it. So if you were a really good one, this was great, and then you lay the leaves down. And the reason that you're gonna have to stop me, because I could really, this is such interesting stuff, it's so rich and deep. The reason that Key West was such a base for the cigar industry is because it's very humid there. It's very warm and very humid. So even though during the era, people did have some cigar factories up in New York, once the tobacco got shipped up there and it got cold and dry, the leaves would get so brittle that they then were not supple enough to roll well into a cigar. So Key West was the place. They would import the Cuban tobacco, Key West, and then Tampa. But first was Key West. So very interesting history of this city. A small city, most people know it today only as a resort town. And the traces of Cuban heritage and politics are very difficult to find in Key West. There's not much trace at all now.
So you're saying that area went through a fire?
Yes, in 1886, a terrible fire that burned down 18 of the cigar factories, 600 private homes, like these little homes that Chaveta was describing, and other homes too. It burned the town hall, it burned churches, other centers, and so a lot of people evacuated at that moment. Some went back to Cuba, some went to Tampa. But some very plucky Key Westers were like, nope, we're going to rebuild, and they did rebuild. And the opening, actually, of the book is set in 1898, so a dozen years later, in the San Carlos Institute, when the news of the Treaty of Paris comes to Key West, and this was treaty that ended the Spanish-American War, as it's called, which was the war of expelling Spain from Cuba. Yeah. So there are a couple of chapters set in 1898 that bookend the story that takes place in 1886. Yeah, yeah.
Because sometimes within those years, I believe America experienced the first hurricane. Was it between 1886? I want to say between 56 and 86, if I'm right.
This is a really good question. I don't know when, like, the first hurricane made landfall in the United States. I actually don't know that.
Because they're so close to Miami. I was just curious.
Yeah. There was a really famous hurricane that happened in like 1868, 69, and there was big flood in Key West. And the Spaniards back in Cuba were really hoping that it had wiped Key West off the map. But it didn't. It didn't. They recovered from that. Yeah. And that one is mentioned in the book, but I don't want to give a date because I'm not great at remembering exact dates. But yes, it's in there. Yes. Thank you. Are there any other questions?
I just have one more.
Yeah.
At what point did you realize that there were 6 voices who had a story to tell?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure exactly at what point it was in the planning for the novel, but I knew that I wanted to take the risk of speaking from a number of different subject positions, even subject positions that are not my own, because to tell this story only from one unified perspective would be to do an injustice to how incredibly complicated and diverse the Cuban community was in Key West at that time, and how class conflicts, racial conflicts, gender conflicts, they were simmering, and there were tensions around that. And so I, began research, and I thought, okay, the 3 young women came a little sooner, and then I thought about the men and who they would need to be to represent these different positions in society. There were women working in the cigar factories right alongside men, which is, again, something different, and getting paid, in many cases, the same. They didn't get the little measure of tobacco to take home with them, which the men got, because it was assumed that women didn't smoke, which was not true. But women working, so I knew that there needed to be a woman working in the cigar factory to be like a laborer, and she's like, she's like pro-strike, she's very gutsy, she wants to go to Cuba and be a mambisa, and the mambisas were guerrilla fighters who were women, who fought alongside the men, with guns and riding horses and with machetes and so on, and so she wants, that's Chaveta's, she's a feisty little figure. So I wanted there to be someone like her, and I wanted there to be, a wealthy, quite spoiled woman, as Sophia is, young woman. But also she has ambitions and strains against the, the gendered strictures of her time. So she's got some very unpleasant characteristics, as I mentioned, but she's also sort of a prototypical, young lean-in type of feminist. She wants to run her own business, and she doesn't understand why she's going to be confined to tea parties and waltzes and things like that, and so on and so forth. So I wanted a soldier, I wanted a lector. Who were these lectores? What was their background? How did they end up doing this strange work of reading and giving basically a university level education to the cigar rollers, manual workers, who were sometimes literate and sometimes not, but auditorily they got this phenomenal education. And I will say that the political theory that was being read by lectores at the time was cutting edge political theory from all over the world. So they were reading Marx and Engels, and they were reading Proudhon, and they were reading Mikhail Bakunin, the anarchist. They were reading this stuff to the cigar workers. So it was you can understand why there would be a lot of political foment at the time, yes. And then the cafetero, and I named him after my father, the one who died by suicide. I wanted to, this is kind of one of the gifts of being a fiction writer is you can bring people back to life and give them a happy ending. Thank you.